become a member and support this work. Today, we will discuss how the design for St. John the Baptist came to be in terms of broad movements in the Catholic Church, in architectural style, and in history that were the context for the collaboration of the parish, the architect, and Frank Kaczmarczyk. This is the story of how Minnesota was a crucial place for the intersection of the liturgical movement and the modernist movement in architecture. There are significant parallels between the two movements. Architecture gives form to intangible ideas, and as such, we can understand liturgical modernism as the way that the ideas of the liturgical movement are expressed physically. As a liturgical consultant, Kaczmarczyk is responsible for helping to bridge theology and literature. To understand how we got here, I'd like to turn back the clock 150 odd years to the 19th century as people from Sweden, Ireland, Italy, and Germany settled in Minnesota. A group of Benedictine monks from Germany settled near St. Cloud in the 1860s and supported further waves of German immigrants in the area. German immigrants brought with them a liturgical tradition of congregational participation. This was counter to the official tradition of the church, the Tridentine Mass, in which members of the congregation spent the majority of Mass engaged in personal forms of prayer until it was time to receive Holy Communion. The celebrant performed the sacrament in Latin while facing the altar, away from the population. This is Mass ad orientem, wherein the high altar is at the east end of the church, in some cases pressed against the back wall of the chancel. The chancel, where the clergy performed the Mass, was often separated from the nave, the space for congregates, by a rail, at which attendees knelt to receive communion. This way of celebrating the Mass was very individual and deeply rooted in tradition, but a revolution of modernity was simmering in the church. The liturgical movement refers to the events and ideas that modernized the church in an attempt to re-engage adherents. In the early 20th century, the liturgical movement was percolating in many places across the globe. One important node was the Benedictine monastery at Maria Laach in Gleis, Germany. The Dialogue Mass was celebrated there beginning in 1921. During this ritual, the congregation participated in reciting prayers and in the offertory procession. Among the concepts propagated by the abbey was the controversial celebration of Mass versus populum, with the priest facing the assembly. Maria Laach welcomed curious visitors and used publications to spread ideas. The monks placed emphasis on a community of believers and supported a theological interpretation of the church not as a house of God, but as a house of God's people. Despite the progressive style of celebration, the Abbey Church at Maria Laach is archetypal for pre-Reform churches. The building, completed in 1216, is a significant example of German Romanesque style. Characteristics of this style are visible at the exterior, the semicircular arch motif, and the sturdy character of the masonry walls. 6 towers accentuate the symmetrical harmony of the floor plan. At the interior, the plan of the church is basilican, whereby the worship space is arranged longitudinally with a long, narrow nave for the lay congregation that faces the chancel. This interior is hierarchical. Architectural elements draw the eye forward and up. The design emphasizes the clergy, which is separated from the congregation by several steps, a choir and a screen. Though the location for highly progressive conceptual reforms, the Abbey Church at Maria Laach was very traditional. 400 kilometers away, on the other side of Germany, an important node for the modernist movement in architecture was founded. In 1919, the Bauhaus School opened in Dessau, founded by architect Walter Gropius. The mandate of the school was the creation of Gesamtkunstwerk, a total design, that unified all of the artistic disciplines through mass production and an emphasis on function. The international style, as the work coming out of the Bauhaus would come to be known, was the most potently theorized variant of several styles tied up in the modernist movement. Modernism was global, as architects and designers across the world embraced new construction technologies and prioritized function at the expense of ornament. Institutions of experimentation like the Bauhaus educated individuals who brought ideas along with them. In 1932, the first exhibition of modernist architecture in the US was held at the Museum of Modern Art, showcasing architects from the Bauhaus and beyond. This exhibition is credited as the formal introduction of the international style to the US. The texts, images, and individuals were moving across the networked globe between institutional nodes, generating ideas like electricity to fuel the modernist movement. Similarly, the liturgical movement occurred between nodes like Maria Laach and, here in Minnesota, St. John's Abbey in Collegeville. This Benedictine monastery was not only responsible for welcoming German immigrants to the region, but also for importing progressive ideas. Monks traveled between St. John's and Maria Laach and brought influential texts from Germany back to Minnesota, where they were translated and published. St. John's is the location of the exceptional Abbey Church designed by Marcel Breuer. This significant Minnesota building is a pivotal design for this study, as it represents an inflection point in the liturgical movement and the career of Frank Kaczmarczyk. Kaczmarczyk first came to the Abbey in 1941 when the monastery was served by a collection of Romanesque masonry buildings that looked like this. Kaczmarczyk spent much of the next 13 years in Europe, visiting as many cathedrals, monasteries, museums, and monuments as he could. When he returned to Minnesota in 1954 to teach art at St. John's, Kaczmarczyk was well-versed in sacred art and design. He arrived at a fortuitous time as the monks were embarking on an ambitious campus redesign. The abbot solicited Kaczmarczyk for suggestions about who to invite to apply for the job. Kaczmarczyk suggested Marcel Breuer, the Bauhaus-educated architect. The collaboration between Breuer and the Benedictine monks in St. John's is legendary, as the monks had a clear vision for the potential of modernist architecture, and Breuer adapted his design sensibilities to meet the theological goals of the monks. During the design process, Kaczmarczyk was again tapped for his knowledge of art and design, this time to assist in the selection and commission of sacred art for the Abbey. This was extremely useful for Breuer, who would not allow the Gesamtkunstwerk to be foiled by unattractive art, and being born Jewish, later converted to Lutheran, was not familiar with the parameters for Catholic art. Kaczmarczyk, trained in both art and theology, was the perfect go-between. This was Kaczmarczyk's first official post in the role of liturgical consultant, also as a liturgical designer. This picture is one of the crypt chapels below the main sanctuary. The altar was designed by Kaczmarczyk. The sculpture of St. Luke on the side was commissioned by Kaczmarczyk. The design of the Abbey at St. John's is significant not only for the ambitious sculptural quality of Breuer's design, but also because it is deeply influenced by the liturgical movement. The choreography to engage the community begins when the bell banner calls the faithful to worship and acts as a threshold between the sacred and profane. Upon entering, the congregation passes through the baptistry. Theologically, this reminds the believer of their initiation into the faith. Architecturally, the antechamber works as a moment of compression before the release of the nave and is a place for the congregation to gather. Once inside, the trapezoidal plan accentuates the gravitational pull towards the altar. The altar is designed such that Mass can be celebrated in either direction. These design elements represent the church as a house of God's people. In the sanctuary, a vestigial element remains. Small communion tables surround the altar that were designed to act as an altar rail. Vatican II found that communion is a sacred act, is a sacrament of union, and ensuing interpretations viewed the rail as a barrier, and the element disappeared. The Abbey Church opened in 1961, just before the Second Council of the Vatican. This council's focus on updating the church culminated years of organized advocacy from the liturgical movement. The primary documents that came from the council provided information on how to update the liturgy, including the use of vernacular language during Mass and the celebration of Mass versus populum. Theological guidance from Vatican II was abundant. Less clear were the architectural implications. As such, consultants like Kaczmarczyk were extremely useful for interpreting the doctrine in matters of design. In the mid-century, many congregations were looking to build a new church as enrollment surged. The percentage of Americans who were members of a religious organization skyrocketed from 25% in 1900, 40% in 1940, 57% in 1950, up to its peak at 63% of the population belonging to a religious organization in 1958. Some of this growth in faith is attributed to demographic shift, as many young families in the post-war era sought out a parish. Some scholars also attributed the religious boom to shifting identities as ethnic, neighborhood, and regional ties faded. Americans seeking a sense of belonging turned to the church. Congregations adapted programming to accommodate and expand from just Sunday service to become a social hub with facilities like schools, community meals, and the place I was relegated to as a cranky child, the cry room. By the 1950s, the country was spending $2 million every day on the construction of religious buildings, most of them in the suburbs. Protestants saw the suburbs as a new mission field. Catholic, Jewish, and Orthodox communities were established by children of immigrants who were coming into prosperity. With the church construction boom came designs in every architectural style, often sorted along denominational and regional lines. Colonial revival became the semi-official architectural style for the Latter-day Saints, popular in the South and Mid-Atlantic regions. Lutheran congregations were among the first to take to modernism, represented in Minnesota by the Saarinen design for Christ Church Lutheran, also the fabulous Sovic building that we visited earlier today. New technologies like thin reinforced concrete shells allowed for increasingly sculptural approaches to design. The invention of laminated wood trusses were particularly popular in the Midwest, in part because of the area's role in the timber industry and the population's familiarity with barns. These technologies allowed architects to make visual metaphors like praying hands from a steeply pitched roof or the interior of a boat from bow trusses. Interestingly, theologically conservative traditions were among the most willing to embrace modernism. For Catholics, the modernist move in church architecture was the topic of great debate. Concerns over whether or not the modern style was sufficiently Catholic spread in journals, but as early as 1947, the Vatican specified that modern art and design should not be excluded from Catholic worship. Liturgical consultants also came to take on an educational role, helping clergy and parishioners to embrace design elements previously unfamiliar in places of worship, such as seating arranged radially around the altar, like here at St. John the Baptist. The parallel development of the liturgical movement and the modernist movement and their intersections across the globe, combined with the history of immigration and religion and the personal history of Frank Kaczmarczyk, gets us here to St. John the Baptist. This notable example of liturgical modernism opened in 1968. The architects at Shiflett, Hutchison and Associates worked with Kaczmarczyk for liturgical consultation and to coordinate design for key interior furniture pieces. The exterior uses the late modernist language of abstracted geometry to evoke a castle. These bays also define the functions of the space within, demonstrating the modernist maxim that form follows function. The plan is resolutely not basilican, with multiple aisles intersecting the nave. Seating for the congregation surrounds the altar on 3 sides. This arrangement positively insists on the communal aspect of the Eucharist. Architecture, rather than ornamentation, emphasizes the mysteries of the sacrament, as the clerestory windows above the altar use light as a material to highlight the location of transubstantiation. Kaczmarczyk and Hutchison's collaboration is expressed as Gesamtkunstwerk, as the forms of Kaczmarczyk design for the chancel furniture evoke Hutchison's designs for the building. The Kaczmarczyk designed altar is a simple, bulky form with 3 legs, constructed of cold spring granite. This design is tectonic as the material expresses its true form. At the time construction was completed, a modest crucifix hung on the wall behind the altar. A Kaczmarczyk designed sanctuary lamp provided the only other decorative piece. The lamp itself resembles a Bauhaus sculpture. Other Kaczmarczyk designed furniture at the altar are all designed to highlight their natural materials with no excess ornamentation. At a later date, the Kaczmarczyk designed tabernacle was relocated to be behind the altar and a contemporary baldachin added. The Kaczmarczyk designed floating canopy hung perpendicular to the ceiling, used to denote the sacred tabernacle, and now hangs above the baptismal font. This beautiful piece consists of simple rectangles nested around a central opening and serves to anchor the space. The elements of this design work together to express the function of the building as a house of God's people. This is a communal space for an engaged congregation, a total design of liturgical modernism. I want to leave you with a provocation passed on to me by Craig Rafferty, a local architect known for his designs for places of worship. We are discussing the traditional basilican plan, which comes from ancient Rome. Modernist churches like this one with a radial plan may at first seem like a rejection of tradition, a contemporary invention. Craig argued that this was actually a timeless practice, predating the Romans even, hearkening to a time when Christians had to practice their faith in secret, gathered around a table in basements. This practice of gathering at an altar is what ties liturgy to history. Perhaps the truly new aspect of liturgical modernism is not the form or the material, but bringing worship into joyous public celebration of community. Thank you so much for listening. We have time for a few questions, but first I just want to mention that in the spirit of community, all are welcome to stay for the 4:30 Mass, and Pat has booklets with additional information about the building available. Thank you. Any questions?
What was it about the community in Germany in the 20s that had them, was it something related to, this would be after World War I, or something else that had them start looking at the liturgy differently as part of that transformation for how that reflected on how services were practiced?
Yeah, I love the question. I can't say for certain. I will say it started even earlier than the 20s, and I think that really the Benedictine order is very interested in study and fraternal community, and so I think that what I imagine is that they kind of encouraged each other, and I really see it, or I've read about it as this area of experimentation, and I think it was quite incremental, starting with